Hey, adult Sunday school leader. I start off each week saying that, Sunday school leader, because, you are more than a teacher. You are a leader. You're a leader of that class. You help guide the discussion, and hopefully you're leading your class in discipleship. So, hey, adult Sunday school leader. Hey, have you ever looked back on your life and realized that there was a specific moment in time that changed forever your life? You didn't know it at the time, but later you look back on it and you realize that. Well, that happened to me. I'm going to share that with you a little bit later on. We are starting a brand new unit this week. It's called Stand Up, How to Fight Injustice. This week we're looking in Esther chapter 2, verses 5 through 10 and 15 through 17. The title of the lesson is Be Ready to Stand. And the point of the lesson is that God is always at work behind the scenes. Now, we're going to be in the book of Esther for 6 weeks. We're going to be looking at injustice and how to combat it. Let me give you a couple of trivia facts about the book of Esther. You may know these already, but it's, of course, one of two books that's named after women, Esther and the other one be Ruth. It is the only book that does not mention God. Now, it possibly also the Song of Solomon or Song of Songs. It all depends on the interpretation of one word, but we're going to say that this is the only book that doesn't mention God. All right, injustice is all around us, isn't it? We can look just here in the United States. We're 150 years after the Civil War. We're 50 plus years after the Civil Rights Act, and we still live in a country with extreme prejudice. We don't not only have racial prejudice going on, that's an injustice, but we also have human trafficking. That's a global issue. We have religious bigotry and hatred, religious intolerance. We can look at the beheadings that ISIS does, as well as even in our own country, just religious hatred. All right, so how do we stand up against these injustices? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at the next 6 weeks, all out of the book of Esther. You might want to help your students find the book of Esther in their Bible. Now, more and more have a Bible app that they just look at their phone or their iPad or whatever during class and during the sermon, and that's mighty fine. But for everyone else, you might say that to go ahead and bookmark that book of Esther because you're going to be in it for 6 weeks. As you're telling them that, you might help them along, prod them along to help find it, because there are going to be some folks with a hard copy Bible in your class that have no idea where the book of Esther is. So you might say something like, okay, you're going to go through the Old Testament, you go through the Samuels, the Kings, the Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther right there before Job and Psalms. So that will help them find that book. Of course, we are in the Old Testament, and there will be a lot of difficult names that will be difficult to pronounce. And so you don't want to call on your class member to read unless you know they know this ahead of time, that they can figure out those words, because it is embarrassing for people to stumble over those words. So if you read with confidence. I've mentioned this several times before. Don't stumble over the words, or worse yet, to skip those names and gloss right over them. Well, let's get a little backstory on Esther, just to bring us up to speed as to where we are. So Judah was taken into captivity by Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. And Cyrus the Great of Persia, also known as Cyrus II, and Persia is modern day what? It's modern day Iran. He conquered, or that kingdom conquered the Babylonian Empire in 539 BC. So Cyrus was welcomed as a liberator. It was Cyrus that issued that decree that Jews could go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the city and the temple, and actually use some of the resources of Persia. And we see that written in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, most of the Jews did not return, but chose rather to stay in Babylon in captivity in the relative comfort and success that they enjoyed. So here's where we are in the story. We have Esther. She's a Jewish girl. Her Hebrew name is Hadassah. She was an orphan raised by her cousin Mordecai. Now, this week's lesson is it's setting up the lessons for the next several weeks. In this lesson, we really don't see any injustice, but we do see God at work behind the scenes, which is the point of the lesson. And now, some things to remember as we go through this lesson, that even in the midst of our day-to-day drudgery, of what we consider the worst of times even, God is still working to accomplish his will. It doesn't matter how good things are or how bad things are, God is still working. Even through those who don't know him, or even through those who seem to be radically opposed to God and his purposes, God is still using them to accomplish his will. So here's what we see this week. We've got a young, beautiful Jewish girl. She's taken to a palace to compete, more or less, in a beauty contest to become the next queen. This is kind of like an ancient version of The Bachelor, isn't it? To whom will King Xerxes give the rose? So she was under the care of this eunuch named Haggai. And Haggai was in charge of the harem. He was a eunuch, as I mentioned. That reminds me, I have to tell this story. When I was at my first church in Kansas, there was a Sunday school teacher who was also a farmer, and he was teaching a lesson. I don't know if it was this lesson or a similar lesson, but it had the word eunuch in it. And he came up to me and said, Jim, I'm just not sure what a eunuch is. And so it's one of those where at church, and I wanted to I wanted to tell him the truth, but I wanted to do so tactfully, okay? And how do you do that with this? So he was a farmer. I said, so you know what a steer is, right? Yeah. I said, well, a eunuch is a human steer. And the light bulb came on. Oh, okay. So anyway, human steer. Anyway, Esther won the favor of this eunuch, and he gave her preferential treatment. Now, we might want to romanticize this story of how this kind of a rags to riches story, how she came from nothing as an orphan girl and we'll see later became queen. Now let's put ourselves in the place of Esther. Young girl, Jewish girl, even though she was raised in this culture, she's still not in her culture. She's separated from the only family she knows of Mordecai, taken to compete in this beauty contest to become the next queen, put in with a bunch of other girls and young women. And, you know, it's got to be like, here I'm going to relate another couple of TV shows here, kind of like The Bachelor, or if you've seen the Sister Wives show, it's got to be something like that, where you've got all these women living together, and they might start off nice, but you know there's got to be some jealousy, especially if there's a prize at the end for the one who's going to win. And so you've got all that going on as well. Maybe even some sabotage of trying to make the other person look bad or whatever. Anyway, long story short, Esther gets the rose. Actually, she gets the crown. She becomes queen. Now, what can we take away from this lesson? Okay, I know you can read your leader guide and get a lot of good background information and other things, but what are some takeaways from this lesson? Well, we've already mentioned that God's at work all the time behind the scenes, right? And becoming queen here, that wasn't the end of the story. That was just the beginning. Here's another thing to think about. Whatever you've been blessed with, God wants to use that. Whether that's your talents, your position, your intellect, even your looks. Okay? And that sounds a little odd, doesn't it? Because we're not supposed to judge on appearances. But God can use that even to influence others. All right? Sounds a little weird. But usually, being good looking goes with being popular. Okay, I don't know anything about either one of those categories. But who else has influence among popular, good-looking people, but other popular, good-looking people, right? That good-looking cheerleader, that handsome football star, who can better influence other cheerleaders and football players but those two kind of people? All right, each of us has a sphere of influence. Whether that's with our family, with our job, with our friends, and we're to use that sphere of influence to lead others to Christ. All right, so you're not the best looking person in the crowd. That's okay. You still have other talents and abilities, intellect, whatever, that God wants to use wherever he places you to influence others and to lead them to him, okay? Also, God can use those bad circumstances in our lives to bring about his will. We already mentioned Esther was an orphan, an exiled Jew, taken to live in a harem with a bunch of other women. That's terrible, right? She's separated from her family, but God is using even that situation to bring about his will and to help his people later on. All right, I want to close with a personal story. I don't have that card in front of me now, But in the spring of 1980, I know some of you guys probably weren't even born then. In the spring of 1980, I was a freshman at Louisiana Tech. And I was looking at, of course, getting a summer job. And I was looking to get a summer job where my dad worked. He was an accountant, a CPA. He was a controller for a local tire company. All that to say, my grandmother died several years ago, and as we're going through her stuff, she kept every card that we ever sent, from the 60s, 50s, 60s on up. And here was an Easter card dated 1980. And my mother had written this Easter card to my grandparents, talking about their taxes would be coming in soon and all this stuff. And she also said, Jimmy, who is me, Jimmy hopes to hear this week if he'll get the job at the tire store. Now, you think, what's the big deal here? Well, for one thing, I don't even remember applying at the tire store. I must have. But if I had gotten that job at the tire store, which I didn't, and I guess I was probably a little bummed when I didn't get it, end of the world, that kind of thing. If I had gotten that job, I would not have worked with my grandparents that summer, the summer of 1980. And for those of you who remember, that was that hot summer that I worked outside in pipeline construction. That was the summer I met my wife, Northwest Oklahoma. So if I had gotten that job, I wouldn't have met her, and who knows what series of events that would or would not have would have come from that. So all that to say, I didn't get the job. I was probably bummed at the time, but there were bigger and better things waiting for me that I had no idea about. And that's one of the takeaways we can learn from this lesson. Anyway, hope you have a great lesson. This is a great time to encourage your class to start back if they hadn't. You got a brand new unit, new 6-week unit coming up. Good time to get back in class. So don't forget to pray for them, contact your class, and I'll pray for you guys as well.